Hey, welcome to the latest episode of Stumbling Toward the Eschaton. We are right now looking toward Sunday, October 4th, and the wonderful texts and all the stuff happening in the world as we approach that Sunday. We got a great gospel text, and it's Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 16.
And basically what this text is talking about is Jesus' opinion on what happens if you get divorced, and should that be all right to do?
Yeah, it's an interesting text. I mean, that's the first part of it, is this Pharisee comes up and, he tests him. Is it okay for a man to divorce his wife? And he goes back to the question of, okay, so what did Moses command? And he said Moses allowed it. And then he goes on talking about how, divorce is not the best thing in the world. It's not something that, we really want to be dealing with, not in the sense of that it doesn't happen in the world, but it's not the best thing. And I think most people, those that are not married, those that know some divorce, that divorce is not the best thing in the world.
Yeah.
Nobody sets out being like, it'd be awesome today if I just got divorced.
Exactly. Not
those sorts of things. But Jesus talks from it, especially from that perspective, how it's something that we don't want to happen. But even part of the struggle with divorce is, well, how do we put this? Things over time change.
Mm-hmm. Because back in the time when Jesus was around, it was hey, if a guy divorced a woman, that woman and those kids are going to have no rights because they didn't have the suffrage that we had now.
Exactly. Exactly. And first century Palestinian area, women, children, they weren't people.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it's in many ways a command, you should not get divorced, he hits it hard. And I would argue, and I think I'm not the only one that argue, that in some ways it's a protection for women in that day.
Yeah. And following, with that now, because nowadays women have all those rights and there's all of those different kinds of programs that'll help them even if they're struggling. And yeah, that's kind of how times have changed. Because they, a modern day representation of this would be with, in the Islam religion, how the woman has no rights unless they're with a man. And so that was kind of how
exactly.
it was.
And in very conservative yeah. Islam, women don't have that. Wasn't there the woman that wanted to compete in an event? And her husband said no?
Yeah, it was, she was like a bicycle racer or something like that. Forgive me if I'm wrong. But she needed to go to another country to participate, and her husband took away her passport, and that was completely okay for them to do.
So, I mean, a glimpse of that, but that is the time. And so you have this distinct possibility where it's just fine for God to be like, I'm going to divorce you. I can keep you under the thumb. I have this threat, yada, yada, yada. And all of a sudden, then you have nothing. Mm-hmm. So there is that perspective. Obviously we're not as far as we'd like to be in some ways, even in our culture, in our world today, but definitely farther along there. And so some of our perspective as we come to the text, it always has to be what's going on in Jesus' day with divorce. And the heaviness of you just can't divorce somebody just because you feel like it and leave them out in the cold.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are dimes to dollars. There were issues of abuse and struggles then, just as there are today. And safety's key. So even as we look at it, that is useful. But there's also the second part of it as well, which I think helps highlight that. Because it's also looking at protection of people that can easily not be protected. Because he goes on, then even in verse 13 through 16... a lot of people have heard this, and I'll even read this. People were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them. And the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them. For to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." And he goes on. But children are also in that category of, divorced women.
Exactly. Because coming from my parents divorced, and we were quite in the struggle for the next 9 years because we didn't have a solid father figure. And the struggle is right now with my stepdad, him moving in. I've never really grown up with that kind of authoritative kind of figure. So it was a very power struggle between him, me, and out of nowhere my grandma, because she kind of took the place as the top of the head of the household.
You gotta love grandma.
I know, my grandma's pretty good. But yeah, with that going on, it's very hard. And when you're a little kid, there's nothing you could do to stop it. And if anything, little kids are the thing that bring it on the most. So that's a lot of stress on parents to have kids. So
It is. And even here, if you talk about people with subsistence lifestyle, and I just butchered that word, but you know what I'm saying, that kids are, in some ways, until they can work, a financial burden.
mm-hmm.
And so here you have, and these texts go together, Jesus speaking on behalf of little children. They wanted to keep him away because, these dirty street urchins want to be around Jesus. He's the Messiah. He's like, no, you come to me. And then even just beyond that, they're welcome. He sets up probably the least of people, least often divorced women, least of anyone is random children that are running around who are probably orphans, all things considered, and says, it is one like this that the kingdom of God belongs.
Mm-hmm.
That is a far cry from a dude just walking up being like, hey, it's illegal for me to divorce my wife or not. Mm-hmm. To a sense of the very reign of God, the great gifts of God, belong to these children, these street urchins.
Mm-hmm.
And then he takes them up his arm, and he lays his hands on them, and he blesses them. It is a very interesting text in that it covers this weird ground of what is protection for the least? What is peace for them? What is grace for the least? And at that time, definitely the divorced. And the children are amongst the least. Mm-hmm. And that is a key question. I'm just always amused, too, because I got kids. I got little kids. Mm-hmm. You don't need to go into them. But let the little children come to me. Do not stop them, for to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. Which always blows my mind what that specifically means. Because I've seen how my kids receive things, and I don't think that's the mark that Jesus wants for people receiving the kingdom. Some of my kids are like, can I have more? Like, what do you want? More kingdom? I want more kingdom.
More Jesus, yes.
Yeah, and well, maybe that's part of it. Just the overjoy of getting that they want more.
Yeah.
But they also you give them something, and they're hilarious. So that is the grand mystery. And in some ways, that is often the question I use of the text. Obviously there's a lot of meat here. A lot of the question about what does God... Not what, but how does God want us, and how does God's self care for the least? But again, on our plate then, so what does it mean to receive it as a little child? And that's a weird concept. Mm-hmm. And that's often where I go with that text, because it's always taught. You kind of preach and think about the stuff that you say, wait a minute, what? Mm-hmm. If it seems clear, that's nice, but it's the confusing things you got to go with.
Yeah. And with the kind of stuff when they're like, oh, if the children want me, let them come to me, like all of that kind of stuff, is kids sometimes also don't know what they want to. So if they'll think that, oh man, like I can't do this, maybe Jesus will help me do this for me, like all of that kind of stuff. I don't know. Jesus might not be the best Algebra 2 kind of guy. Like we don't know if he's... so
that was his major.
Oh yeah, that was his major. How could I forget about that?
Major in algebra, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but it's kind of one of those things that with if you're taking a Protestant view on it, not a lot of miracles happen. A lot of times God rewards hard work, and so
Faber.
Yep.
Well, and that's even the struggle too. Is that even within Protestantism, you got different views on how those things work. Mm-hmm. Luther was often of the mindset, and this is not a popular thing, and we'll figure out how to tie this back, that those that are necessarily really, really good won't get the greatest rewards in this world. Mm-hmm. Which, as you talk about Weber, the Protestant work ethic, right? Mm-hmm. You do good, you get good. Almost Protestant karma, right?
Yep.
You gotta love Protestant karma. It's almost as good as Protestant caramel.
That's a story for another time.
Protestant caramel. But there was the sense, and you even point to the 12 apostles. How many of them were murdered for the faith? 11 out of 12. The guys,
Yeah.
there's this great example of 11 out of 12 apostles murdered because of their faithfulness. Well, if I'm faithful, that means A, I will get, a brand new huge home, or, wait a second, what do the apostles get?
Yeah.
So there is that struggle of faithfulness and wanting to get much out of it.
But yeah. So is there anything else you'd want to add to how you're going to put this into your sermon on this Sunday?
Well, I tell you what. Really, really, the question is, so what does God do in these things? And that's sometimes the chief things. A lot of this is, how do we receive it? But the interesting thing always is that God is the one that gives it. And there's that generosity in it. And I like how there is that generosity in the section about the little children held up in that he even says Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her. Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. So there's a sense of God gives this generously out of a generous heart, while these guys want these distinct lines and wealth because of their hardness of heart. And it is God's compassion that comes out in these things. And if God showers compassion on the least, what does that mean?
And so to tie up this with a current event that's going on, in speaking about how if a man got rid of his family by divorcing them in the Palestinian time, they were put in homelessness. And in London and a couple of other countries now are starting these things called homeless spikes.
Oh, yes! Yes.
Yeah, and with what those are is different places. I know you've probably seen them sitting on the street corner, homeless people with the change cup and all of that kind of. And what London and those other cities are doing is they're putting spikes on the ground, or they're putting statues or any of that kind of stuff, so those homeless people have nowhere to sit. And that a lot of there's a debate going on how humane is that, because with a lot of people that are homeless, they end up getting mental disabilities because people are treating them like animals and objects, and they're people, and a lot of the time too, they're veterans because our country doesn't have that good of a program for them. That's starting to change too. How does this make you feel, Pastor Mike?
Well, the London homelessness thing is a key issue with these things. Because again, homelessness, this can easily fall under the least category. And, the least of us are those that have, next to nothing. And I tell you what, there is this interesting thought process that must go into it. And again, I'm guessing. I was not part of, the London groups that said, here's what we should do. But here is this issue. And I think there is two major ways. And I hate, there's only two types of people. I hate those lines. But let's say there's two veins that are probably ways of looking at it. Either the problem is homeless people or the problem is homelessness. And if you look at the problem as homeless people, well, then the spikes make perfect sense, right? We just got to get these homeless people somewhere else, right? We got to beautify the city, yada, yada, yada. They're the problem. We need to get rid of them. It's, like when you have, pigeon spikes.
Yeah.
And, I'm not saying homeless people are pigeons, but if you start treating homeless people like pigeons.
Yeah. And with a lot of people too, there are a lot of older people are, hey, you know what, they should go get a job. And it's not really that easy. There's a lot, there's been a down slope on the job output. So a lot of people who did have successful careers are now sitting there on the street corners.
Well, in London too, in Europe, in many places of the globe right now, that's the problem. I don't think they were thinking of it as the problem that could be number two, which is homelessness is the problem. And so if homelessness are the problem, the people cease to be perpetrators as the homeless people being the problem, because then they're perpetrators, and then they become victims of this. Again, there are numerous factors that lead to homelessness. Part of the problem that we have with homelessness is we think it's a simple thing, like laziness. Well, there's mental disabilities. There's physical disabilities. There is PTSD, like you said, with veterans. Coming back from combat and those sorts of things, it changes you. Sometimes not for the best. Let's be honest. And so if homelessness is the problem versus homeless people, and you're willing to look at a manifold thing, obviously this is not the best. And that's the struggle sometimes, is how do you convince people or work with people or in general find good ways of dealing with the manifold problems that's homelessness.
Yeah. So I think that's how we're going to wrap up the discussion for this week's episode of Stumbling Towards the Eschaton. So if you enjoyed this, make sure to check out our other videos and stay tuned for next week. You want to say goodbye?
Hey, have a good day, everybody.
All right. Bye.